Pavarotti had a rule about amplifiers. Not about volume, not about sound quality. The rule was simpler and harder than that. If a musician needed electricity to be heard, Pavarotti didn't consider them a musician in the way he understood the word. He considered them a technician who had learned to use a machine, someone who borrowed power from a wall socket and called it art. He said something close to this backstage at the Royal Opera House in November of 1967. A journalist had asked him about the guitar music coming out of London that year. The Marshall stacks, the feedback, the sounds nobody had heard a guitar make before. Pavarotti tilted his head the way he did when a question didn't quite deserve the effort of a full answer. "The amplifier," he said, "is a confession." The journalist asked what he meant. "It means the instrument alone is not enough, or the player is not enough. One of the two. A real musician fills the room with what is inside him, not with what is inside a machine." The quote ran in 2 Italian publications and 1 British music magazine. Nobody from the rock world responded. There was no reason to. Pavarotti was 32 years old and had already been filling houses without microphones for 6 years. When he stood on a stage and opened his mouth, the sound reached the back row of a 2,000-seat theater by physics alone. You didn't argue with that. You listened to it. 3 weeks after that interview, Pavarotti was still in London for a Covent Garden rehearsal cycle that had stretched into December. He'd been invited to a private gathering in Chelsea, the kind of evening that happened often in London that year, a flat belonging to a music journalist who knew everyone and kept a door open late. Maybe 20 people. Producers, musicians, a photographer, people who moved comfortably between worlds. Jimi Hendrix arrived around 10:30. He came in quietly, which surprised the people who only knew him from photographs. No entrance, no posture, nothing that announced him. He shook a few hands near the door, accepted a drink, and found a chair near the corner. He was wearing a dark jacket that had seen better decades. He didn't seem to be performing being relaxed. He just was. Someone introduced him to Pavarotti about 20 minutes after he arrived. Pavarotti was gracious. He knew the name. London in the second half of 1967 made it impossible not to. Are You Experienced had come out in May and the city was still working out what to do with it. Every guitarist in England was trying to understand how one man and a Stratocaster were making sounds that seemed to come from outside the instrument's normal range of possibility. They talked briefly. Pavarotti said something polite about the album. Jimi said something polite back. Then the conversation broke apart into the rest of the room, the way conversations do when neither person is performing for an audience. For a while, the evening moved the way those evenings moved. Scattered, warm, unhurried. Then someone brought up the Royal Opera House interview. The amplifier is a confession. There was a pause at one end of the room. Not theatrical, just the specific pause that happens when a sentence lands near the person it was about. Someone glanced at Jimi. Jimi looked at his drink. He didn't look angry. He didn't look offended. He looked like a man who had heard something and was deciding whether it was interesting enough to think about. There was an acoustic guitar in the corner. It belonged to the journalist who owned the flat. A battered Epiphone archtop that had been sitting there since someone played it 2 hours earlier. Nothing special. The kind of guitar that lives in a flat because someone once bought it with good intentions and then got busy with everything else. Someone said, not quite as a challenge and not quite as a joke, "Jimi, that guitar works." Jimi looked at it. He didn't answer immediately. He finished what was in his glass, set it down on the side table with no particular drama, and stood up. He walked to the corner, picked up the guitar, and sat back down with it on his knee. He checked the tuning without asking if anyone minded. The way you check a tuning when you're genuinely interested in whether it's in tune rather than performing the act of checking. It took him about 40 seconds. His ear caught the G string, adjusted it twice, then moved to the B string once. His face held no expression during any of this. He was just listening to the guitar tell him where it was. Before we go further, if you're watching this and you've never subscribed to this channel, we're still under 1,000 subscribers and we're just getting started. A subscribe from your phone takes 5 seconds, and it's the only way the next story finds you. Pavarotti was mid-conversation on the other side of the room. The person he had been talking to had turned slightly toward the corner where Jimi was sitting. Pavarotti noticed the shift in attention and followed it without quite stopping what he was saying. Jimmy didn't announce what he was going to play. He didn't explain the choice or check if the room was ready. He pressed his thumb across the strings once, very softly, like a question he was asking himself. Then he started playing. What came out of that guitar was not loud. That was the first thing. In every conversation about Jimi Hendrix in 1967, the word loud appeared somewhere in the sentence. The Marshall stacks, the feedback, the volume that had pushed crowds back from stages across England. None of that was in this room. What was in this room was close, deliberate, something that asked for your attention rather than took it. He was playing a blues structure, but doing something with it that bent the form without breaking it. His thumb handled the bass notes on the lower strings while his fingers moved independently on the upper ones. So the guitar was playing rhythm and melody at the same time, as if two instruments were having a conversation through one set of hands. The phrases between chord changes had the quality of language. That feeling where one phrase leads naturally to the next, and you understand the logic of it without being able to name what the logic is. Pavarotti stopped talking. Not gradually. The conversation he had been in just stopped, the way it stops when something more important than the words appears in the room. He turned fully toward the corner. He stood very still with his glass in his hand. The room had been quieting for about 30 seconds before it went fully quiet. One conversation continued for a moment after the others ended. Then that one stopped too, mid-sentence. After that, the only sound in the flat was the guitar. Pavarotti had spent his professional life studying what sound was capable of, what breath support required at volume, how a trained body moved air through a space in ways an untrained body couldn't. He understood these things the way a structural engineer understands load-bearing walls, not from books, but from having lived inside the problem for 20 years. What he was watching did not fit inside any of that. The guitar wasn't loud enough to impose, but it was filling the room, not by force, more like something that had been given permission to be there. The high notes arrived without any audible effort from the player, without the sense that someone had reached to get them. They simply existed at that altitude. Altitude wasn't a consideration. A woman near the window put her hand flat against the wall without appearing to notice she'd done it. A man who had been moving toward the drinks cabinet stopped where he stood and didn't continue. The room organized itself around the sound without anyone deciding to do that. It just happened. Jimmy played for about 4 minutes. His eyes were mostly down, occasionally closed. He wasn't performing for the room. He was inside the music, and the room was present for it. When he finished, he let the last note decay completely before lifting his hand. Then he set the guitar back against the wall, not precious, just attentive, and went back to his chair. The room came back to itself slowly. Someone started talking again, then someone else. The conversations restarted, but quieter than before, as though the room had established a new level and everyone in it was adjusting to it without being asked. Pavarotti didn't move for a moment. He was still standing where he had been, glass in hand, looking at the corner where the guitar leaned. His expression wasn't surprise. Surprise is too active a word for what was on his face. It was something quieter. The expression of a man who has been working from a measurement and has just understood that the measurement was slightly, importantly off. He said something to the person beside him, quietly, not across the room, not to Jimmy. He didn't borrow anything from the machine, Pavarotti said. What he just did, that came from inside him. A pause. I said that an electric guitarist cannot fill a room without electricity. I was describing electricity. I was not describing him. He didn't address Jimmy directly. He didn't make a moment of it. He said what he said the way you say something. You're still in the process of believing, and then he let the evening continue around him. Jimmy across the room was already talking to someone about something else entirely. Jimmy died in September 1970. He was 27. Pavarotti lived until 2007. In the decades between, he gave thousands of interviews. Most of them stayed inside the world he occupied. Opera, the voice, the tradition of Italian singing. He rarely wandered into rock music. But once, sometime in the mid-1990s, an interviewer asked him whether he'd ever encountered a non-classical musician whose technique had genuinely surprised him. Pavarotti was quiet for longer than the interviewer expected before he answered. There was an evening in London, he said, late 1967, a private gathering. Jimi Hendrix was there. He played an acoustic guitar in a room of perhaps 20 people. The interviewer waited. I had said not long before that evening that amplification is a confession of weakness, that the electric guitarist hides behind the machine because without it, there is nothing. A pause. I still think there is something true in that as a general observation. But general observations are approximations. That night I understood I had been making an approximation and that Jimi Hendrix was not one. He was a specific thing, precise in a way my categories were not precise enough to hold. The interviewer asked what specifically surprised him. The sound filled the room without force, Pavarotti said. Most musicians, when they are not amplified, push. They work to be heard. What he did was not work, it was release. The distinction between pushing and releasing, that is the thing I spent my entire career trying to teach. And I watched a 24-year-old with a borrowed guitar do it without having been taught it at all. He stopped there. The interviewer moved on to something else. The people who were in that Chelsea flat in December of 1967 have talked about that evening over the years. Not often, and mostly among themselves. The way you talk about something you witnessed that you can't quite explain to someone who wasn't there. What keeps coming up, in the versions that have been told, is not the playing itself, but the moment after. Pavarotti standing still, glass in hand, looking at the corner where the guitar leaned against the wall. A man who understood what sound was capable of better than almost anyone alive, standing still, quietly working out what to do with something he hadn't expected to hear. The guitar was back in the corner. Jimmy was back in his chair. And one of the more complete certainties Pavarotti had built about music, stated in print, stated without hesitation, had just become slightly less certain than it had been 20 minutes before. If you've ever heard something that made you question what you were sure about, leave it in the comments. And a like takes 1 second. It keeps these stories finding the people who need them.